For what reasons, if any, are we morally permitted or obligated to use the coercive apparatus of the state? Justice appears to be one thing which offers such a reason. We seem morally justified in using coercion to rectify past injustices, stop current injustices, and deter possible injustices in the future. In short, realizing justice provides us moral justification for using force. In current political life, both the progressive and conservative lay claim to the moral high ground. According to them, their political end goals are in accordance with justice and virtue. If their end goals were realized, they would have created a world of perfect injustice and virtue, which is, in essence, a utopia, the best of all possible worlds. Realizing utopia requires stamping out injustice completely, and maintaining a utopia means maintaining justice. Since the political end goals are thought to be in accordance with justice and virtue, it is no wonder then that people find progressive and conservative political views attractive. As Robert Nozick remarks, quote, "No doubt people will not long accept a distribution they believe unjust. People want their society to be and to look just." End quote. What about the liberal? How do their values accord with justice? And does full realization of their goals produce a utopia? And is that utopia a world of perfect justice and virtue? In the previous essay entitled Liberal Utopia and the Meaning of Life, I argued that liberalism does offer utopian vision, which I called a meta-utopia. This meta-utopia is a framework for utopias in which the state is required to treat citizens as ends in themselves. Only in this type of liberalism were individuals able to develop their moral faculties and aesthetic appreciation due to their political autonomy, and pursue their own conception of utopia with individuals who shared their vision. The liberals' utopia can provide our lives with meaning while also facilitating our pursuit of it. But is the meta-utopia compatible with justice? For progressives and conservatives, the answer will be no, with the reason being that the underlying principles of the liberals' meta-utopia allows for or enables injustice to exist. In other words, a meta-utopia is, at its core, unjust, or at best falls short of perfect justice, or so this argument would go. In this essay, I contend that liberalism is the only political view compatible with the demands of perfect justice and virtue. To advance my thesis, I make two complementary arguments. First, I outline a fundamental conception of justice which is shared across the political spectrum, entitlements, and show how progressivism and conservatism are ultimately incompatible with it, while liberalism is. Second, liberalism, and its meta-utopia, is the only view which is compatible with a world of perfect justice and virtue, or so I shall argue. The progressive and conservative both assert that they have captured the moral high ground. According to them, their particular conception of utopia is a world of perfect justice and virtue. The moral warmongering of the progressive and conservative can be seen in how they think not just of each other, but also of the liberal. Both progressives and conservatives fear that society will either be thrown out into the state of nature, or be forced to kneel down before a tyrannical leviathan. But they see the other party as that which propels us towards either of these hells. Progressives fear that conservatives will drag us backwards in time to places where our moral concepts and social organisation was impoverished, while conservatives see progressives as accelerating the collapse of society as we know it. And they both despise the liberal because they see in them a useful idiot or unwitting accomplice of the other side. The progressive sees the liberal as allowing the evil of conservatism to endure, while the conservative sees the liberal as allowing a Trojan horse through the gates of society. According to them, the full realization of their political ambitions, in essence utopia, would be the full realization of perfect justice and virtue. The purpose of the state, for them, is to pursue justice. Of course, it is highly dubious whether their end goals could ever be fully realized, whether a state can ever be made perfectly just, but this does not stop them from trying. But it is not the political ambitions or utopia which is the problem, but people. People are imperfect. People fall prey to greed, fear, selfishness, lust, pride, vanity, anger, sloth, apathy, and so on. Thus, when their utopian ideals fail, it is not the fault of their means or end goals, but rather the fault lies with the citizenry. While the progressive and conservative may have differing conceptions of human nature, for example that humans are either primarily predisposed to being selfless or selfish, both agree that human nature is flawed. We aren't perfect, nor can we be. There are, roughly, two ways both can go with this wisdom. First, they might take our flawed nature as reason for why the political end goals should be imposed upon us. Since individuals cannot be just or virtuous of their own accord, then they must be made to be so. Or, second, they might admit their conception of utopia is unachievable, but is still nonetheless the realization of perfect justice and virtue. To prove their point either way, the progressive and conservative ask us to envision their utopia and compare it to the status quo, how corrupt our liberal governments are, how those same governments bail out big banks and funnel taxpayer dollars into certain businesses. Liberal politicians enable the worst impulses of their ideological opponents, are either too soft or too hard on crime, engage in insider trading and get kickbacks from large corporations while they bend laws to their wills. Surely, the progressive and conservative say, people need to be coerced into behaving correctly, and the world liberalism is capable of cannot be compatible with perfect justice. Liberals, of course, also recognise our imperfect human nature. However, the liberal rejects the heavy-handed impositions of justice and virtue which the conservative and progressive might opt for. They don't think such a strategy will work, so instead, liberals often maintain that their view harnesses our worst impulses for the benefit of all, making the best of a bad situation. This sort of argument parallels the same kind we see advanced in support of capitalism, i.e., capitalist economy is the only way we can harness our greed for good. If only we weren't so greedy, then we would naturally organise our economy along socialist lines. For example, Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations that, quote, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not in their humanity, but to their self-love." End quote. In the Constitution of Liberty, F.A. Hayek writes that since we can't ever know about whether each person's holdings are in accordance to their moral merit, the next best thing we can do is have a market system which allows holdings to be distributed in accordance to perceived value of one's actions to the benefit of others. And finally, Ayn Rand defends capitalism precisely because she thinks selfishness is a virtue and altruism is evil. In taking such a path, the liberal appears to ultimately agree with the progressive and conservatives about matters of justice. That is, the liberal thinks liberalism is only good because it is the best we can do given the reality of our imperfect nature. But still, the liberal concedes that their position isn't what perfect justice could ever look like. Perfect justice would look like the progressive or conservative utopia. Liberals are only liberals because they are pessimists. Liberalism is only the best we can do, but it isn't the best, nor can it be. Part of the reason for this is because modern liberalism offers no utopian vision or end goals to pursue which, if realised, would make the state perfectly just. In the previous essay entitled Liberal Utopia and the Meaning of Life, I argued liberalism did offer a utopia, which I called a meta-utopia. To summarise this idea, a meta-utopia is a kingdom of ends, in which the state respects its citizens as ends in themselves. For the state to respect individuals as ends in themselves requires that the state not just respect each person's body and property, but their self-chosen ends insofar as those ends do not violate others. How people end up organising their lives, whether civil, private or economic, is up to the citizens, and how they shape life and society is outside of the domain of the state. In this way, a meta-utopia allows for each citizen to pursue their own conception of utopia, with others who voluntarily choose to assist them. Question before us, then, is whether this utopia, i.e. the meta-utopia, is compatible with justice. In what follows, I shall argue that not only is liberalism and its meta-utopia compatible with justice and virtue, but that it is only liberalism which is compatible with perfect justice. One cornerstone of justice is distributive justice. Distributive justice involves matters of who gets what goods, resources and services, what people get and how many, and when, and so forth. For the remainder of this essay, let's shorthand goods, resources and services, etc. as holdings. For utopia to be realised and maintained, it's required that holdings be justly distributed across the state's citizenry. Robert Nozick observes that theories of distributive justice are patterned. There are principles which specify how the distribution of holdings is to be allocated along some dimension or dimensions. We make sense of patterned theories of distributive justice when we consider the following slogan: to each according to their ... The dimension or dimensions a patterned theory posited effectively fill in this blank. For example, each according to their ... needs, wants, usefulness to society, value added, perceived value added, hard work, moral merit, moral worth, virtue, IQ, intelligence, maturity, race, sex, caste, gender, hustle, alpha maleness, position in society, desires, deserts, piety, beauty, and so on. According to the progressive and conservative, a world is just insofar as it fits the preferred pattern of distribution, that is, each according to their blank. If the proposed dimensions are correct, then we seem morally justified in enforcing their realization with coercion and violence. A liberal, however, need not adopt a pattern theory of distributive justice. In this section, my aim is to reject pattern theories of distributive justice as they are incompatible with a more fundamental conception of justice, justice as entitlement. Since pattern theories are essential for progressive and conservative utopias, the rejection of a distributive justice means the rejection of their utopias. Progressive and conservative ideals are not compatible with perfect justice. Entitlements are those things which we have legitimate claim over. Justice as entitlements is prior to distributive justice. Not only are entitlements a more fundamental type of justice than distribution, but entitlements are accepted across the political spectrum. For example, a large part of the Marxist critique of capitalism hinges upon justice as entitlement. The worker, having mixed in their labour with materials, has come to acquire certain entitlements over particular things, namely, the things they mixed their labour with. The inherent injustice of capitalism, according to Marxian orthodoxy, is that the capitalist extracts surplus value from the worker, value which the capitalist is not entitled to, but the worker is. In Anarchy, State and Utopia, Robert Nozick develops his own theory centered upon entitlements, which he calls the entitlement theory of justice and holdings. For shorthand, we'll call this the entitlement theory. In short, Nozick spells out the exhaustive understanding of the entitlement theory as follows. 1. Principle of acquisition. Person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of justice and acquisition is entitled to that holding. 2. Principle of transfer. A person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principles of justice and transfer from someone else entitled to that holding is now entitled to that holding. And 3. Principles of rectification. No one is entitled to a holding except by repeated applications of 1 and 2. Someone with a holding which was not gained via 1 or 2 is not entitled to it, and it may be seized from them. The objection I wish to marshal is that pattern theories of justice, e.g., each according to their blank, are ultimately theories we ought to reject. Pattern theories, as those preferred by the progressive and conservative, are ultimately incompatible with a more fundamental conception of justice that we share across the political spectrum, entitlements. To show why, let us reconsider an updated version of Robert Nozick's Wilt Chamberlain case, which I presented in a previous essay. It runs as follows. Let us suppose whatever your favoured end state were realised, that all property was stripped from us and redistributed in accordance to whatever pattern realises your favoured end state. Let us call the time in which the end state is realised D1. D1 is a perfectly just society because it accords to your favoured end state. Now suppose that Hassan, a greatly in-demand streamer, is a great attraction. Suppose he signs the following sort of contract with a streaming platform. That not only does he receive a greater percentage of each subscription he receives, also an extra 25 cents is to be added on top, all of which goes to him. He starts streaming and people cheerfully subscribe to his channel. People spend the extra 25 cents. They're excited to watch him stream and watch YouTube videos and tell them how every problem in their life is, or was, caused by late-stage capitalism. For his subscribers, the extra 25 cents is worth the subscription. By the end of the year, D2, Hassan ends up with a significantly larger sum than the average income and even larger than any other political pundit streamer has. Voluntary exchanges have moved us from D1 to D2. D2 is different from D1. D1 was a perfectly just arrangement because it perfectly matched the pattern of distribution required to realize your favored end state. But is D2 unjust? Have the people who lived under D1 and moved to D2 acted in unjust ways? According to a favored pattern, they have. But to merely assert that it is unjust simply because it violates the favored pattern begs the question. Why should we think that justice necessarily requires adhering to a pattern? After all, everyone still has their particular holdings. The conservative might be okay with this new distribution of holdings because it still fits with their pattern. For example, they might suggest that this new distribution is in accordance to value added, or at least perceived value added. Conservatives and capitalists often judge themselves to be deserving of their specific belongings because they have added value to others. It is just and moral that individuals who provide value should be allocated more resources and holdings than others, such as their reward. Much in the same way, individuals who don't have many holdings, for example, people living in lower social economic classes, deserve to be there because they haven't rightly earned their goods. They haven't or don't add value. The conservative might also think the new distribution has something to do with intelligence or IQ or street smarts or whatever. Hassan deserves his worth, so the thought goes here, because he was intelligent and invested his time and energies by identifying a market. The crypto coin investor deserves their holdings because they're smarter than the rest of us. Or to each according to their bravery. They took the risk and so deserve the reward. So conservatives are likely to suggest that, rather than showing their pattern is incorrect, the Hassan case I've provided merely reinforces their view. The progressive may have a harder time vindicating our intuitions about the Hassan case. However, a particular breed of progressive might argue that I've begged the question here. That is, I've slipped in the existence of private property and market exchanges. This type of progressive would contend that in a world of perfect justice, neither private property or market exchanges would exist. There would be personal property, in essence, your belongings, but there wouldn't be any private property, in essence, ownership of the means of production. But the progressive and conservative who advance any of the above objections to the Hassan case will be sorely disappointed because we can construct a variation which undermines both of their objections. Let us again suppose whatever your favourite end state were realised, that all property was stripped from us again and redistributed in accordance to whatever pattern realises your favourite end goals. Let us again call this time in which this end state is realised D1. D1 again is a perfectly just society because it accords to your favourite end state. But let us make two further stipulations. First, that private property has been abolished. There exists only personal property. While private property is that which is capital or the means of production, personal property is that which refers to consumer or non-capital goods, such as one's own bed, toothbrush, guitar, and so on. Second, that our perfectly just society will allow individuals free time to use as they wish and to use their personal property as they desire. With this setup, let us now consider a new example. One member of this society, Emma, is a dutiful worker. With her free time, she talks politics, news, and current events. She talks about how unjust the previous distribution was before and adds colour commentary to news, providing her own views upon current events. Emma doesn't have anything particularly interesting to say, nor does she have any novel contributions to make. Nonetheless, and for whatever reason, other members of the community enjoy what she has to say and spend their own free time listening to her. Emma first begins using her personal home, allocated to her by the pattern of distribution we've selected, to host her political conversations. Over a few months, more people hear about her political and current affair musings and, with their own free time, choose to spend it listening to Emma as well. Many members of the crowd are highly appreciative of Emma's rants and begin to express their gratitude for being given the pleasure of hearing her speak. Some do with words of encouragement. Others do so with gifts, giving away portions of their personal property to Emma, whether that be in the form of money or belongings. Emma would like to give more people the opportunity to spend their free time listening to her, so she floats the idea of streaming on the internet. Unfortunately for her, the patent did not allocate her a computer. A couple of members of her audience, who spend their own free time building computers, gift Emma with one, and with it she begins streaming. No longer limited to physical space, her audience grows even larger and, with it, expressions of gratitude by way of gifts. Emma has accumulated a significantly larger portion of personal property when compared to her audience. Emma begins spreading it amongst the people who are closest to her, such as family and friends. When she's not streaming, Emma enjoys gambling in her free time. And though she enjoys it, she's not very good at it, and loses about 25% of her personal property to others she's playing against. Through acts of gratitude expressed by ways of gifts and engaging in leisurely gambling, all of which have been done voluntarily, and with the personal holdings allocated to them by the chosen pattern, and all done during their own free time, we have moved out of D1 and back into D2. The Emma case avoids both the conservative and progressive responses to the initial Hassan case. With regards to the progressive response, that is the elimination of private property, D2 was still arrived at from D1 because there are things other than economic transactions which can upset patterns. Private property and money are not the problem. It's the simple fact that individuals can make choices about what to do with what they have, and what they choose to do with it can upset patterns. Emma has not produced her newfound wealth from exploiting anyone in the Marxian sense. She has not extracted value from workers. Emma doesn't own the means of production. All she owns, which produces her wealth, is her personal belongings. With regards to the conservative, it is a mistake for them to think that the current distribution of holdings is in accordance to value added, or intelligence, perceived value added, or IQ, or anything. Though one might make the argument that Emma herself deserves her wealth at D2, it's hardly obvious that her family, friends, and gambling partners do. They haven't done anything. They weren't intelligent or added value or had impressive IQs or anything else. How Emma's friends, family, and gambling buddies acquired their patent-disrupted holdings are by non-patent-driven choices made by Emma. Conservatives and progressives ultimately ignore that disproportionate holdings can be generated in a variety of ways which are not patent. Gifts and donations are just two examples. How else can holdings be generated? Well, we can receive marginal profits, winnings at gambling, receive a share of our partner's income, receive interest on loans or return on investments, make for themselves as much as what we have, find things, and so on. The cause of Emma's wealth is the accumulation of voluntary choices made by free individuals using their own personal, not private wealth on property, as it is allocated and according to one's blank, during their free, personal time, which they are thought to be at liberty of possessing and using in accordance to their own desires. Personal interests of many individuals end up converging upon a shared interest. In this example, listening to Emma, and in appreciation, they voluntarily gift her a portion of their personal holdings. And this is but one example of individuals doing just one thing with what they are allotted by a pattern. Imagine how far we could stray from the pattern if we take in the totality of the things we can do with what we have. I visited this in the last essay, but let me repeat myself here. We can choose how to spend our time, money, efforts, and labour, and with who to spend them on, and when, and why, and for what reasons, etc. Who we choose or choose not to associate with, or who to disassociate with, when to associate, for how long and in what ways, for what reasons and under what terms, and so on. For the conservative and progressive, the liberty of individuals to live how they choose, both in terms of private, civil, and economic choices, is tolerable only insofar as it fits their pattern. Individuals are only allowed to live as they choose within the bounds of what does not upset the preferred envisioned end result. Liberty, it has been said, upsets patterns. In the Hassan case, and especially the Emma case, both seem free of any moral wrongdoing. Their extra holdings are acquired outside of the pattern, yet it's intuitively clear they have done so without any injustice occurring. Why does it seem perfectly just for them to acquire these new holdings? The reason, it seems, is because they are entitled to these holdings. Nozick's entitlement theory, as described earlier, vindicates our intuitions about the Hassan and Emma cases. In both, each acquire their holdings through the principle of acquisition and principle of transfer. Everyone in D2 has what holdings they do because these two principles haven't been violated. Given each person's holdings are just, then the total set of distribution of holdings is also just. What objections might the progressive and conservative muster? They might argue that the entitlement theory is an artifact of bourgeois morality, only used to justify the status quo and cultural hegemony of the capitalist class. This objection, however, is misguided, as it ignores the universally shared role that entitlement plays despite one's political position. As I mentioned earlier, a central part of the Marxist critique is that the injustice of capitalism is that the capitalist class gains a surplus value which they aren't entitled to. Only the workers are entitled to the profits. Conservatives too care deeply about how things made with one's own blood and sweat are one's own. Distributive theories not only ignore our entitlements, but they fail to make any sense of how things come into the world. Again, as the progressive and conservative recognise, things do not just pop into existence. Holdings appear to come into existence by way of our labour. And since they come into existence by labour, they come into the world already attached to people who therefore are entitled to them. Treating holdings as things which are merely to be distributed ignores this basic reality. It treats holdings as if they were from matter from heaven. The entitlement theory cannot be rejected by a progressive nor a conservative, as it serves as the basis for their understanding of justice. Another objection the progressive or conservative might raise is that the entitlements can be subsumed under a pattern. Entitlements can just be another dimension alongside the each according to their blank, to which their conception of distributive justice can make sense of. Even those of the liberal tradition seem to support such a view. For example, Adam Smith and F.A. Hayek observe that we often transfer our holdings for exchanges which we take to be beneficial for ourselves. Entitlements appear to be patterned along to each according to perceived value added. But this objection fails because it fails to recognise that many of our entitlements, or coinciding with patterns, are not themselves patterned. As I've already mentioned, we can be entitled to holdings which are gambling winnings, gifts, donations, returns of investments, and so on. There is no dimension or set of dimensions in which holdings should be distributed and realised along. A different strategy the progressive or conservative might deploy is raising the question of why anyone would do something which upsets their chosen pattern. For example, in taking the Hassan case, the progressive or conservative might wonder why he would stipulate a contract, or work overtime, or pursue a secondary revenue stream, etc., when the pattern satisfies justice. Nobody would want to upset a pattern of perfect justice, or so the objector thinks. The obvious reply we can give to this question is that people care about things other than how holdings are justly distributed. People care about having certain things, doing certain things, and being a certain sort of person. For example, one might enjoy collecting sneakers, or owning a factory, or having a well-furnished house, or a personal library, and so on. One might enjoy cooking, grilling burgers, driving fast cars, playing golf, streaming video games, engaging in online debates, producing and spreading communist propaganda, peddling bizarre conservative views about men's health, and so on. One might be a musician, or bodybuilder, or artist, or scientist, or woodworker, or seamstress, or so on. Regardless of whatever pattern we prefer, we can imagine people caring about things which are not accounted for or satisfied by the pattern of distributive justice. So to get those things, we must do things outside of that pattern. Would the progressive and conservative allow people to acquire or engage in activities they care about if it upsets their pattern which realize their utopia? The answer is obviously no. To realize and maintain a pattern of distributive justice, whether that which is preferred by the conservative or progressive, would require significant government oversight and invasion of our personal, civil, and economic liberties. The reason being that, given enough time, our voluntary actions and individual choices will ruin their pattern of distributive justice. They might retort that citizens will voluntarily choose to refrain from behaviour which would upset their pattern. Reason being so they might say, is because once the pattern is realised, we'll see how just and good it is. Now they've seen the light, people will do what's right, in essence, maintain the pattern. Parties of both ends of the political spectrum seem to engage with this sort of reasoning, such as socialists, certain types of Muslim or Christian conservatives. That is, once their perfect justice is realised, people will just see that they were right the whole time, and be compelled to believe it right and work towards maintaining it. But this sort of retort strikes me as incredibly naive and unrealistic. First, it supposes the chosen dimension or dimensions of the pattern actually are the good and just. But given how vehemently we disagree about such issues, historically, culturally, geographically, etc., about which dimensions are the right ones, make the retort a dubious one. Second, even if the dimensions were the right ones, people aren't compelled by reasons. We don't just see goodness and recognize it as such. And third, which follows from the first and second, it is highly unlikely everyone will even agree about what those particular dimensions are. And fourth, it's incredibly unlikely that individuals can gather enough information about their actions, let alone the actions of others, to figure out whether their course of action would upset the pattern, and even if they could do this, it is highly unlikely they could coordinate those actions with others to help maintain the pattern of distributive justice. A final objection both the conservative or progressive could advance against the entitlement theory is that it begs the question. They might say that one is not entitled to a holding unless that person is deserving of it. For example, the progressive might say that the millionaire doesn't deserve their monetary gains, and so because they're not deserving of it, they are not entitled to it. Likewise, the conservative might say the unemployed single mother has done nothing to deserve their social security check, and thus she isn't entitled to it. What holdings one deserves is prior to entitlements, and distributive theories of justice address just deserts. The progressive and conservative are back in. There are two reasons we should reject this objection. First, what one deserves lends itself to pattern theories, to each according to what they deserve. So, pushing this line of objection attempts to smuggle a pattern back in, even though we have already provided compelling reasons for rejecting them. This objection just reiterates the very point under contention without addressing the argument we've advanced against it. Second, the notion of what one deserves is not a neutral one. One needs to plug in something so one may draw conclusions about what one does and doesn't deserve. There's nothing to stop us from saying that what one deserves is what one is entitled to, whether that be either by the principle of acquisition or the principle of transfer. In other words, if you're entitled to a holding, then you deserve it. And if you aren't entitled to a holding, then you do not deserve it. Again, the considered objection simply attempts to smuggle in its pattern without providing an argument for it. So, to summarize, in this section I argued that pattern theories of distributive justice, such as those upheld by progressives and conservatives alike, ought to be rejected. Patterns are incompatible with entitlements. The entitlement theory serves as a bedrock belief about justice across the political spectrum. I showed how any pattern, whether one supported by a progressive or a conservative, ultimately violates entitlements because they do not respect, first, what people are entitled to, nor, second, what people may do with their entitlements. Since realizing and maintaining patterns are inevitably incompatible with our most basic conception of justice and holdings, which is entitlements, then imposing any pattern would be unjust. Given pattern theories are a necessary feature for bringing about the utopian visions, the progressive and conservative utopian ideals are not compatible with perfect justice. According to the entitlement theory, a world of perfect justice would be one in which every person has the holdings they are entitled to. Given liberalism is the only political position compatible with non-pattern theories of justice, it is only liberalism which can provide a utopia compatible with perfect justice. In this section, I argue that a world of perfect justice is only compatible with the liberals' utopia, a meta-utopia. The argument, roughly, is this. A world where everyone is perfectly just and virtuous does not resemble any progressive or conservative utopian vision. Instead, such a world ends up resembling the meta-utopia because it shares liberal values. A world where everyone is perfectly just and virtuous would have voluntarist, anarchist, libertarian or liberal, capitalist, and diverse characteristics. In his final work, Why Not Socialism?, influential Marxist philosopher G.A. Cohen advances a powerful moral argument in favour of socialism. In this slim monograph, Cohen presents us with a thought experiment which he thinks shows us that we all, deep down, are really socialists. He asks us to consider a group activity like a camping trip and imagine it run along socialist or capitalist lines. In the socialist camping trip, everyone, recognizing they are participating in a shared activity on which they are working their best to enjoy themselves, will share all in common. They will share labour evenly, food and resources equally, and be united in their common cause. The same cannot be said for the capitalist camping trip. With each camper looking out for his own best interests, the best at fishing will lord over the others with their excess catches, making others do more menial tasks like chopping wood or latrine cleaning. Another camper who just lucks upon a berry bush will block others from using it unless they pay them for access. And one camper who brought most of the tents will charge the others exuberant prices for the use of those tents, while doing nothing for the group. Which trip would we prefer to go on? Which trip is better? Cohen's answer is obviously the socialist one, and it's hard to argue with him on that. But the lesson Cohen draws from this is that socialism, or at least his version of it, is a realization of perfect justice and virtue. His point is not that we can make the world like the socialist camping trip, he recognizes our imperfect human nature, but rather that a socialist world would be an intrinsically better world. Even if we can't make society like the socialist camping trip, we intuitively recognize that it is morally superior to any and all alternatives. In my experience, many are inclined to share Cohen's judgment about the camping trips and accept his explanation as adequate grounds for vindicating our shared intuition. But how plausible is his explanation? The answer, I suggest, is not very. Indeed, Cohen's argument turns out to be quite poor. We should begin by noting that the desire for participating in a shared activity in which all are working their best to enjoy themselves is not a value exclusive to socialism. Community spirit and social values are shared not just amongst other progressive positions, but also amongst their conservative opponents. After all, standing up for social, community, and family values is often taken to be a defining feature of the conservative politic. We can imagine, then, a conservative camping trip organised around the same communal spirit. However, the progressive and conservative alike might then say that only one of them has got the right type of camping trip, but that they simply disagree about the details. In other words, their utopian ideals are closer to a world of perfect justice and virtue. It's just a matter of who gets closer. But the liberal, they would argue, is not even in this race. Given liberalism's focus upon individuality and liberty, the liberals' camping trip would be much like the capitalist one in which each camper is out for themselves, a proverbial war of all against all. There can be no communal or social values or spirit in the liberal camping trip. We should, however, completely reject this line of reasoning. The political ambitions of the progressive and conservative are not the full realization of perfect justice and virtue. The liberal need not retreat behind the walls of pragmatic or practical realities, barricading themselves behind the claim that since people aren't morally perfect, liberalism will just have to do. The liberal can break the siege by riding forth and crushing their ideological opponents, for it is liberalism which is compatible with perfect justice and virtue. It is liberalism which has the moral argument on its side. Neither the progressive nor conservative have a monopoly on morality or justice or virtue. As I showed in the previous section, a progressive or conservative utopia is incompatible with justice because they need to violate our just entitlements to realize and enforce their pattern of distributive justice. Why, then, should we think either of their various positions are the realization of perfect justice or virtue? After all, ethics, justice, virtue, and morality stand distinct and prior to political theory. The comparative judgment being drawn out of us via the camping trip thought experiment is erroneous because it compares apples to oranges. It compares an ideal to reality and then concludes the ideal is superior. It is no wonder why we think the progressive or conservative camping trip is superior to a liberal one then. They are comparing an idealized camping trip to a non-idealized one. In such comparisons, of course the ideal would be superior. That is why it is called an ideal. So the camping trip thought experiment turns out to be nothing more than an act of mere sophistry. We gain nothing by comparing the mundane to the ideal. As philosopher Jason Brennan observes in Why Not Capitalism, we prefer the socialist camping trip not because it is socialist, but because the campers are perfectly just and virtuous. But justice and virtue are separate from political views. If we are to learn anything from these camping trips, we must compare oranges to oranges and apples to apples. We need to compare the idealized liberal camping trip against the idealized progressive or conservative camping trip. In the previous essay, Liberal Utopia and the Meaning of Life, I argued that liberalism does have a utopia, the Meta-Utopia, which serves as a framework for individuals to realize their own conceptions of utopia with people who share their vision and call us to respect others as ends in themselves, in essence, as autonomous agents with rights and dignity. Since liberalism does offer a utopia, we can compare a meta-utopia against the progressive and conservative alternatives. So, does a meta-utopia have more in common with perfect justice and virtue than the progressive and conservative alternatives? And my answer, an argument, is an emphatic yes. To show why, recall that virtue, justice, ethics, and morality stand independent of political theory. We can imagine, then, a world in which everybody is morally perfect, perfectly just, and perfectly virtuous. In this world, everyone does what is morally right, for the right reasons, in the right way, knows they are doing the right thing for the right reasons, and feels the right way about it. In such a world, everyone has a perfect sense of justice and virtue and always does what both demand of them. What sort of features would this world have, and which political utopia comes closest to matching it? Let's begin with the first half of that question. If we were to imagine such a world, what would it look like? What features would it have? Given everyone is perfectly just, they would ensure that everyone has the exact holdings they are entitled to, either by way of legitimately acquiring it or having it transferred to them. Someone might accidentally have a holding they aren't entitled to. Someone might lose something and another person finds it, but they'd happily and joyfully rectify this by returning that holding to its proper owner. The world would be perfectly just. Given everyone is morally perfect, there would be no need to coerce anyone to doing the right thing because everyone would already be doing it. A morally perfect world would have little, if any, need for the police, or military, or courts, or any governing body, except in those cases in which agents have limited epistemic knowledge and require a third party to help sort through their quagmire. A world in which everyone is morally perfect wouldn't need taxation, because morally perfect people would gladly donate the required amount necessary to ensure that everyone was lifted out of poverty. Perfectly virtuous people see others as ends in themselves and would help to ensure people weren't without shelter, or food, or medical care, and so forth. With the above two considerations, we can see that a world of perfect justice and virtue would have two distinct characteristics. First, it would be voluntarist because people wouldn't need to be coerced into doing the right thing because they would be actively volunteering to do it. And second, it would resemble anarchy, or at most a night watchman state, because many of the functions of the state as we understand it wouldn't be necessary. There might be local councils and town halls and town greens and so forth, better organise some shared communal interests, but by and large the police, military, courts, taxation offices, environmental bureaus, etc. wouldn't exist, or would be significantly stripped down if they were to exist at all. These two characteristics, voluntarist and anarchist, already eliminate large portions of political viewpoints which place especially heavy burdens upon the state intervention. Progressive and conservatives, and even types of liberal views which have large governments, are not compatible with a world of perfect justice and virtue. But there's more. If everyone were perfectly virtuous, people wouldn't be envious, or jealous, or fearful or angry about what other people can do, what they have, and who they are. People wouldn't be jealous of the natural gifts and talents of others, their good looks, metabolism, athletic abilities, intelligence, emotional intelligence, artistic visions, acting, writing, communication, leadership, problem solving, decision making, public speaking, research, or management, landscaping, and so on. People wouldn't be envious of the achievements or successes of others, whether that be in the sphere of their career, hobbies, sports, arts, creative endeavors, or romantic pursuits. People wouldn't be spiteful about other people having things that they don't, such as parcels of land, houses or homes, pets, children, partner or partners, furniture, cars and boats, finances, money, clothes, books, and so on. And when people fail to succeed in any venture of life, whether it be a solo activity such as rock climbing, painting, or writing a novel, or getting their dream job, or a competitive activity such as athletic competition, a business in the marketplace, academic tasks, entering into prestigious institutions, and so on, though they may be sad and frustrated, they wouldn't be envious or angry or direct vitriol at persons who either succeeded where they didn't or whose success came at their own expense. Since there would be no envy or jealousy or anger or spitefulness, a world of perfect virtue would be, I contend, characteristically libertarian or liberal in nature. There are two reasons for this. First, there would be no need to distribute holdings in accordance with some pattern to placate people's insecurities or misfortunes. People would be okay with others having more than themselves because others having more does not mean that any moral violation has occurred. And second, a variety of living arrangements could be compatible and sustainable because people's worst impulses and judgmental attitudes towards the lifestyles of others wouldn't arise. People have the liberty to do what they want to do and be the people they want to be. One might think that the above described world is too individualistic and thus community and social values are lacking, but there is no reason to think this. Strong community spirit, where individuals come together voluntarily under the banner of shared goals and values, is possible in this world. We are, after all, social animals. Communities would hold some things in common, which would most likely be things which either benefit them all or facilitate their joint ventures. For example, town halls, hospitals, roads, green spaces, and so on. Individuals would celebrate particular events together, their shared values, such as their dedication to justice and virtue, and would celebrate their individuality and diversity. Communities would celebrate, not admonish the distinct gifts, talents, achievements, and lifestyles of each individual who make up the community because each member brings something unique to the table. But not everything would be owned by the community, nor would the community be guided solely by communal or social values. Individuals would still have private property and their own ends. Recall earlier that I mentioned that individuals want and care about things other than what they need. The types of things they want are having certain things, such as collecting sneakers, or doing certain things, such as streaming video games, or being a certain sort of person, like an artist or a woodworker. These types of desires are not just a matter of justice and virtue, but matters of love or meaningfulness. And the examples given are obviously not the only things which people can love and find meaningful. Some people envision their value or identity or life's purpose in owning a bakery, or farm, or factory, being a musician or a writer. And it's not enough for them just to run these things while the land, items, and equipment, etc. are held in common. The farmer wants her farm to be solely her own, as does the artist with her art supplies, the musician with their guitar, or the writer with their laptop. In other words, to shape one's life and identity requires owning those means of production completely, not to be shared with others, thus having exclusive access to them. And this desire is not out of selfish or debased reasons. The farmer, for example, wants to shape the farm in accordance to her specific vision. She wants the autonomy to shape her farm as she sees fit without answering to anyone else. And the only way she can realize her vision of a meaningful life is that she does own the farm independently of the community she resides in. In pursuing our projects and ends, it is not just that I need access to a piano or a computer and so on, or that Michelangelo needs some paint, or Martin Luther King Jr. needed access to a Bible, or Hassan Piker needs access to a computer. There is intrinsic value to having access to the same piano or computer or paints or Bible and so on. Objects which are intrinsic to our projects become incorporated into our lives, our identities, and our life story. To give this idea traction, recall an object that you have sentimental attachment to. Might be a teddy bear gifted to you by a loved one, or a guitar which was once owned by your favorite musician, or a house where some great historical event took place, or a book which completely changed your mind about some topic. Whatever the case, imagine the following. Suppose one morning you walk into the kitchen and find an angel at the counter who informs you that while you were sleeping they destroyed your prized possession but then replaced it with an identical object. Would you be okay with that? Or would you think something valuable had been lost? Suppose this angel said it replaced whatever you destroyed with a similar item, perhaps one that was considered better. Would that be okay? Seems to me the obvious answer is no. We don't just accept any alternative to what objects we have, even when the alternative is better. It is not just a copy of capital, but it's this particular copy of capital which a former lover gifted me. It is not just a Volvo, but it's this particular Volvo in which I took my first date. And it's not just a pub, but it's this particular pub which I purchased and took over from my previous employer and mentor, and so on and so on. People form relationships with objects, we incorporate them into our life and identity, and they enrich our existence. Even the most radical of progressives recognize the inherent value in us owning objects so completely that others are not allowed to use them without our say-so. For example, one interpretation of Marxian alienation is that one's life is robbed of meaning when the work is separated from the means of production. The work is alienated, has had his life robbed of meaning, when he does not own the tools which enable him to produce goods and services. Marx recognized that private property is an essential part of our human flourishing. A morally perfect and just world demands it. For one's life to be meaningful, one must have the freedom to shape one's life how one sees fit, to do certain things and to be a certain sort of person. For some people, shaping one's life, the vision of what they want to do with their lives and the person that they want to be, necessarily requires private property, that only they have ultimate control over particular things which others have no right to say how to use. Some people envision their lives as contributing to society by providing certain goods and services, but doing it in the style that best expresses their identity. But not everyone will want to be a farmer, or a factory owner, or whatever. Some people's conception of a meaningful life involves smaller scale activities, such as painting, or writing, or music, but not everyone will be able to support themselves solely with those activities. Some may not want to, and so they need to find means of supporting themselves. In cases such as these persons might strike up contracts with the farmer or factory owner for work and come to an agreement about the type of contract which best suits them both. It is no doubt that the aforementioned result will strike many progressives as the opposite of a just and virtuous world, because the painter or writer, in becoming a worker, is going to be exploited, and exploitation cannot exist in utopia. But such a worry, and any objection which might be fashioned out of it, has already been solved for ex hypothesi. The farmer or factory owner, being as perfectly just and virtuous as anyone else, will not exploit anybody. Instead, they will come to a fair and just agreement with the potential worker. They will come to a fair trade. Given the above, we can see how another characteristic of a world of perfect justice and virtue is capitalistic. It is a world in which people have private property, trade and exchange goods and their services, and have a variety of contractual arrangements. And not only is capitalism compatible with perfect justice and virtue, it also makes our lives better. The notion that a capitalist organization of the economy is not just compatible with perfect justice and virtue, but makes our lives better than collective ownership, is likely to strike many as counterintuitive. What sort of objections might one raise to vindicate this intuition? One way could be to argue that private property isn't necessary to fulfill the task of meaningful living. One might then draw a line between personal and private property, which we've seen earlier. To remind, personal property are things that we have exclusive rights over which are non-productive, for example, toothbrushes or beds or a laptop. Private property, however, is productive property. It produces goods for others to consume, for example, factories, distilleries, and so on. The items I've appealed to, these sentimental objects, fall under personal and not private property. A perfectly just world demands that there is no private property, but allows for personal property, and with personal property, we can make our lives meaningful. Or so this argument goes. But the distinction between personal and private property strikes me as one without a difference. Popular video SES FD Signifier uses his laptop as productive property in which to earn his living, for writing scripts, research, audio recording, video editing, and so on. I use my laptop to do the same thing, but don't earn any money from it. I do not use mine as productive property, but instead do this for fun and in hopes that someone listens to these essays, finds something worth thinking about in them, and adds these ideas to the ongoing conversation. For me, writing about philosophical issues is fun. Since my laptop isn't productive property, while FD signifies is, does that mean I am allowed to keep and own my own laptop and use it in such a way, while he isn't? Surely this is mistaken. The difference between personal and private property, it seems then, is not about owning productive property, but rather if we use that property in a productive way. Communities comprised of perfectly just and virtuous individuals will enable and encourage each other to pursue activities which they find meaningful. Given how varied and wide-ranging our conceptions of meaningful living are, there are going to be many different people, all with different skills and talents, who pursue very different ends. Utopia, then, will consist of a vast diversity of persons with a diversity of skills, excellences, talents, and lifestyles, all of which benefit everyone else in that community, for each, being perfectly virtuous, will be of great use and benefit to the community, providing goods and services those other members need and complementing their skills, talents, and lifestyles. As Robert Nozick puts it, quote, each person prefers being surrounded by a galaxy of persons of diverse excellence and talent equal to his own to the alternative of being the only shining light in a pool of relative mediocrity. All admire each other's individuality, basking in the full development in others of aspects and potentialities of themselves left relatively undeveloped. End quote. A world of perfect justice and virtue will have the characteristic of diversity. It will enable and encourage individuals within a community to pursue their own ends and develop their own unique skills to benefit the community and to make their own lives meaningful. Utopia, a world in which everyone is perfectly just and virtuous, has the features of being voluntarist, anarchist, libertarian, capitalist, and diverse. This means the state, if there even is one, is incredibly small, needed only insofar as to settle disagreements in which the agents involved have epistemic disagreements which they can't sort out themselves, and to facilitate certain types of projects which are in the interests of the community's shared interest and spirit. Beyond that, individuals will have extensive liberties, both in terms of their private, civic, and economic lives. Utopia, when carefully considered, turns out to be the liberals' Meta-Utopia. Liberalism respects individuals as ends in themselves, meaning that they respect persons' minds, bodies, properties, beliefs, values, and personally set end goals. Liberalism is voluntarist, capitalist, diverse, and libertarian. With all that said, let us end by returning back to Cohen's camping trip thought experiment. Consider again the idealized socialist camping trip, the idealized conservative camping trip, and the idealized liberal camping trips. Which of these three would you choose? Actually, that's a trick question. The liberal wouldn't make you choose. That's one of the reasons why liberalism is morally superior. Liberalism also has the characteristic of being tolerant, which is another reason why it's diverse. If you wanted to set up a community along socialist or conservative lines in the liberals' Meta-Utopia, you're allowed to do that. Liberalism allows for citizens to arrange their lives along whatever lines they desire. Progressivism and conservatism don't. This is why utopia is a meta-utopia as described by liberalism. It is a world in which all other utopian ideals can fit within it. So it turns out to our surprise that even by their own lights, liberalism is morally superior to progressivism and conservatism. A world of perfect justice and virtue isn't a world run along progressive or conservative lines. They offer us an inferior product. Their utopian ideals aren't compatible with perfect justice nor perfect virtue. But, paradoxically, if someone finds living as a progressive or a conservative meaningful, then that's fine too, for in the liberals' meta-utopia, they're allowed to. In this essay, I considered political utopian visions and justice. The progressive and conservative think their values are the best match for the demands of justice. Since utopia is perfectly just and their values are thought to be in accordance with justice, then the full realization of their values would be to bring about perfect justice. Liberalism, in contrast, is thought to be the best we can do in an imperfect world. But if people could be perfect, we wouldn't be liberal. Liberalism is thought to be incompatible with perfect justice. I have argued these assumptions are mistaken. Both the progressive and conservative are wrong. It is their conceptions of utopia which are incompatible with justice, and it is instead the liberal utopia which is. I provided two arguments for why only liberalism is compatible with perfect justice and virtue. I first argued that the underlying theories of justice for the progressive and conservative were pattern theories of justice. That is, justice is when holdings are distributed to persons in accordance to some particular dimension. Pattern theories, we found, however, are incompatible with the fundamental view about justice. Entitlements. Justice as entitlements is a shared view across the political spectrum, and to have an entitlement means that one has legitimate claim on a holding and that one may do what they want with it. Pattern theories violated entitlements because patterns do not respect our autonomy in choosing what we decide to do or not do with our holdings. My second argument was that progressive and conservative utopias were not compatible with the world of perfect justice and virtue. When we imagine a world in which everyone is perfectly just and virtuous, we find that world to have the character of being voluntary, anarchist or minarchist, capitalist, libertarian, diverse, and tolerant. These features are only shared with the liberals' utopian vision. a Meta-Utopia, where individuals are treated as ends in themselves. Turned out the Meta-Utopia was the only utopia compatible with perfect justice and virtue. Only in a Meta-Utopia are individuals free to pursue their own ends with their own property and to shape their own life and identity into what they find most meaningful. Progressivism and conservatism, as political ideals of perfect justice and virtue, are unworthy of our political efforts. Their end goals are not appropriate for the state or government because their utopian visions are not only unjust, but thoroughly unappealing. Their utopias do not make our lives meaningful, nor do they realize a perfectly just or virtuous world. Only in the liberals' Meta-Utopia can perfect justice and virtue be found. Only in a state which is voluntarist, minarchist, capitalist, libertarian, diverse and tolerant. Only in liberalism can all of this, and more, be found. Hello! If you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening to this essay. If you like what you heard, leave a like, share it, tell me in the comments, hit the subscribe button. If you hated it, leave a thumbs down, share it with other people who you think would hate everything I have to say, leave a comment, hate rate the video, and you can hate follow by hitting the subscribe button as well. If you'd like to talk to me about any of these ideas I advanced in this essay, you can email me or contact me via Discord or Twitter. I've left the links for both in the video description. I'm not too sure what I want to do for the next essay. I've been writing a couple of things. I might put up one of those voting polls and see what other people think. And anyway, thank you so much once again, and I'll see you in the next video.